Good evening, those of you who are interested in some of these videos, and I hope that I haven't been too impolite by not greeting you. I appreciate you listening, and if you have some comments, I certainly appreciate your input. This particular video is sort of a follow-up on the previous one uh, concerning the mass formation psychosis that Matthias Desmet, the professor from Ghent, the psychiatrist professor from Ghent, or psychology professor from Ghent, uh, talked about and has written a book about. And he was quoted by Robert Malone and also had an interesting interview with Tucker Carlson on his special show on Tucker Carlson Presents, not the regular TV one, but the other um, um, subscription version. In any case, the reason I wanted to follow this up is because I've had some personal experiences, directly and indirectly, with mass formation psychosis. This is a fancy psychiatric name or psychologist name for a phenomena that has been known for a long, long time. And as Matthias Desmet clearly points out, there are many, many instances in which it has been historically described, going back far, far back. Of course, the more recent ones were in the French Revolution and in the Russian Revolution and in Nazism and similar events. But there were also witch hunts, and there were persecutions of all kinds of people. As a matter of fact, the whole idea of witches and of people that have suspected motives or backgrounds is something that goes back. Certainly, Shakespeare uses them in Macbeth, but of course he uses witches in a kind of a very different way. He's not persecuting them. The witches are actually sort of symbolic of the evil that inspires people like Macbeth. But the point is that this phenomenon, and of course there were many books written about it. Some of it was actually foreseen by people like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and others who saw that we were headed, even at the middle of the 19th century, were already beginning to develop this sort of materialistic approach to the world, where we reject, not we, but societies and the majority of people reject anything beyond the materialistic, the day-to-day understood reality. And of course, science, as it proceeded and developed further and further, in the understanding of the people who were not scientists, seemed to confirm this materialistic approach to the world. What most people don't understand and don't notice is that the great scientists were not materialists in the final analysis. People like Einstein, who of course is sort of held up as the model of modern science, it wasn't a coincidence that he criticized the principle of uncertainty, Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, which was a really interesting and very strange introduction of probability into physics. But he criticized it, saying that God does not play dice with the universe. So that's important, because Einstein usually didn't talk a lot about God. That was not a name or a being that he mentioned a lot in his various works. But in that particular quote, which is very well known, it's not a coincidence that he used God. And what you can infer from that, I don't know. I'm not saying that anything particular about Einstein's approach to the Almighty or the concept of the Almighty. All I'm saying is that he used this expression. But there are others. Noteworthy among them was Blaise Pascal, who was one of the most incredible mathematicians at the end of the 17th century. So it's very, very long ago. I mean, we're talking about 300 years ago, more than 300 years ago. And he came up with some of the ideas that have to do with probability. And probability was an introduction of uncertainty into mathematics. And we have to understand that the reason that's important is the Greeks and the Romans after them and the Arabs who came up with algebra, all of them understood mathematics as a description of tangible, concrete, unchangeable mathematical concepts, and there are clear answers to problems in algebra, and there are also clear answers to problems even in trigonometry and calculus. Okay, these answers are pretty clear. Now in calculus, you're beginning to get to the point of the questions of whether there is certainty, because in calculus you talk about limits, and limits as you approach infinity, and of course the moment you include infinity, things begin to get very, very complicated in math. But the point is that the average person, they don't understand how these mathematical concepts, after a certain point, beyond a certain point, begin to look a lot like theology. Theology in the sense that when you start talking about the infinite, and you start talking about numbers that possibly represent the infinite, you're in territory that is way, way beyond the materialist. And of course, this is what great physicists like Einstein and Planck and others understood. And by the way, by the end of his life, Planck admitted that all of the time that he spent as a research scientist in laboratories, studying particles and studying quantum mechanics and trying to understand how these incredibly small particles, units of matter, or parts of units of matter work. At the end of it, he came to the realization, and he said this, it's not my words. Max Planck said, I came at the end of that process to where religions begin. And he meant God. So he saw that all of his understanding, all of his experiments, all of his incredible research only presented a tiny, tiny portion of reality and explained only a tiny portion of reality. And this is what Desmet also talks about when he talks about that the materialists reduce reality to these simple formulas. You can't. And that's the point that's what leads masses of human beings to be able to be led relatively easily and to be terrified and to be scared into accepting wild and crazy ideas and precepts. The most recent, of course, we all lived through was this absurd pandemic, which was really not a pandemic. It was a nasty flu virus, possibly worse than others, but made worse by all of the horrible things that politicians and leaders did, not by the virus itself. Okay, and the response to it, the so-called vaccine and the mandates to put masks on and all this other stuff, really all they did was they elicited, and this is what Desmet says, they elicited this mass response. They terrified people. People were so scared that they were going to die of this virus that they were willing to do anything. put on masks, even when the masks turn out to be totally useless. Because again, much research was done and has been done since the virus is pretty much abated that shows that the masks are totally useless. Sorry, there was a sudden break there. I didn't mean to have that to happen. The computer went off. Anyway, the point is that all this stuff was manipulated by people who want to control us, manipulated by huge corporations such as pharmaceutical companies, the healthcare system, which has become an incredibly monstrous bureaucracy that no longer relies on doctors as individuals. They're simply pieces in the puzzle. They're bureaucrats that are led by bureaucrats. And the terrible thing is that that's just a part of it. The whole society, if you look at American society today, it is run by bureaucrats, whether it's large corporations, look at any one of them, Target, Lowe's, Home Depot, all of them. They're nothing but monstrous corporations run by bureaucrats. The HR department runs them, and the various level managers are simply just servants of the super group that runs the whole thing. Okay, but the bureaucrats, they're the ones that are making the system work. And that's true, again, as I said, in private enterprise. It's also true now, all the universities. Every university, even the smallest universities, are becoming bureaucratized. They're not run by professors and doctors and lawyers and other professionals, teachers who are working in the university. They're run by bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats are well behaved. They do exactly as they're told, and they pass on the various strictures. You must wear a mask. You may not come to this university if you're not vaccinated. They are doing this. They're vaccinating thousands and thousands and thousands of students in the United States that don't need the vaccines. It is harming them. It is harming them more than it is helping them. And there's no scientific data. The thousands of research scientists that have done work on it cannot show any data showing any benefits for those students that are getting vaccinated with this so-called vaccine, because it's not really even a vaccine. It's a genetic alteration. It's a genetic code that is sent into your body, and it causes all kinds of complications, which I don't want to go into because I don't want to waste the time on arguing with other people who have argued much better than I have. See Dr. Malone and others. The point that I was trying to make was that I did experience some of this mass formation psychosis. Because when I was a little kid, and I was lucky enough to be born after the city of Budapest, my birthplace in Hungary, was devastated by one of the biggest battles, one of the last big battles of the Second World War. And by the time I was born, the Germans had been driven out of the country, the German armies, and now, of course, the Soviets came in. But as a young boy, luckily, as most of us are, have one of the few positive experiences of our lives are the first 3 or 4 years when we're ignorant of all the horrors that are going around us. And if we're surrounded by loving family who take care of us and to make sure that we're safe, then we're at least protected from knowing even the moderate or the small bits of evil that human beings are capable of. Unfortunately, of course, sooner or later, even that starts coming out. And by the time I was 9, 10 years old, I began to see what was happening in Hungary. I was going to school. I was in the school in not far from where we lived, in the center of Pest. And I also became, my parents wanted me to be religious. They introduced me to Catholicism, wanted to be a good Catholic, in spite of the fact that my father and mother both had lots of Jewish ancestors. Maybe the fact that they pushed us to be Catholic had something to do with the Jewish ancestors and the persecution that my father and my mother indirectly or directly lived through. Anyway, I was an altar boy at the main basilica in Pest. It's the largest church in Pest, the largest Catholic church. And I went to school on the other side of the street from this basilica. I was right next to it. So I had an experience in one way. Of course, I had an experience with Catholicism, and of course, a 9-year-old, 10-year-old has no idea what that religion means. I began to be familiarized with the rituals of the Mass and serving the Mass and learning the prayers. We learned it in Latin, so I still remember many of the prayers in Latin, and of course all the things that you had to do to help the priests observe the Mass. So that was sort of a physical, external introduction to religion. It was not very theological, certainly not very intellectual. But on the other side of the street, when I was in the school, up until the revolution, there were many attempts made to inculcate in us this communist ideology. And one of the most memorable ones came when I was already in, I think, in 4th grade. And at that time, the communist leadership in Hungary was and a lot less extreme because by 1953 the Stalinist dictator Mátyás Rákosi had been removed and was replaced, and of course even in Russia, in the Soviet Union, there were big changes after the death of Stalin and the speech of Nikita Khrushchev to the 23rd Party Congress of the Soviet Union. So in that less extreme environment, they still try to make us wear the red kerchief of the Scouts. They call them Pathfinders, and everybody had to wear it. And they passed a regulation in school that we all had to wear it. We received the kerchiefs from the school, but then we were told that everybody must wear it. Well, I was one of the ones who never wore it. I took it home and threw it behind a closet that was built into the apartment between our bathroom and our entryway to the apartment, and that's where it was. Somebody had cleaned it out since then, and of course it's not there anymore. But that was the fate of that. So we were the three of us, the two other boys and I. We were not going to go along with wearing this red kerchief. And as I say, by that time it was possible not to do that. If it had happened 4 years before, and luckily I was still too young to be in school. Well, I was in 1st grade 4 years before. And the 1st graders, of course, were not at the time. Were not made to do these kinds of things. But the point was that 4 years before that, the punishment or the threat of punishment would have been much greater than it was when this happened to me. So that was the one in my own life of the effect of this communist psychosis, communist mass formation psychosis. I was surrounded by people who were suffering from it all the time. My father, my mother, and everybody else that lived in that society, because they weren't able to say what they wanted to say. They couldn't just express their opinions because they had to be very careful. If they said the wrong thing, there was a good chance that they could either lose their jobs or even end up in prison. And if it happened 3 or 4 years before this event that I just mentioned, there was a great likelihood that people could be put in prison. Now, my father had the luxury of being a medical doctor, a pediatrician, and he was needed. He had expressed some strong opinions, which he did have some opinions that were pretty anti-communist, but if he expressed them in the wrong place, he could have lost his job, and possibly even worse than that. Of course, this was the way that we grew up, and I remember very clearly many of the details about how it affected me, even as an atmosphere in which the terrible atmosphere in which the society was run. I didn't even mention, of course, that my family had suffered from the previous mass psychosis, which was the Nazi and the right-wing psychosis, the Hungarian government, which wasn't Nazi until the very end, but was pretty right-wing and had some many Nazi sympathizers. Certainly had lots of anti-Semites who were willing to sacrifice the Jewish population, or at least make their lives miserable. Then the Nazis came in and made sure that the Jewish population was sacrificed, including my grandmother, my mother's mother, my father's mother, and my mother's brother, who resisted the Nazis and was taken away to a concentration camp in Germany. So that was that mass psychosis. Then, ironically, we came to the United States, and in the beginning, the United States was still in the 1950s. It was still pretty much the wonderful open place that it had been for many years before that. The degree of technocratic takeover, the bureaucracy, was not yet running everything. It was still an interesting place, very different from Europe, different from anything that I had experienced in Hungary. But it certainly felt much freer, much less constrained. And again, it's hard to put it into words, because as a child, I was 11 when I came to the United States. I only sensed and felt what was going on in the adult world. I didn't really experience it directly. It really started to get bad after I had already spent many years, graduate from college, and started teaching, taught math and English and all kinds of other subjects. And then eventually ended up going to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Munich and worked there for 4 years. And that's one of the first places where I met the new technocratic, socialist, materialist leadership. And that was a scary time, because I had nothing but conflict with these people who were socialists and who were doing everything they could to not destabilize the communists in Eastern Europe. They were supposed to be providing the truth and the factual information to the East Europeans, but all the way they were doing was they were really basically supporting them. Anyway, that was the beginning, and I had many conflicts, and eventually had to leave because they didn't have anything to do with me, and I certainly didn't have anything to do with them. And I decided that I wanted my young family. My oldest son was born in Munich, and he was 4 or 5 months old when we finally left. 6 months old when we finally left. And then I came to the United States, and then came the next great introduction to mass formation psychosis, when I started working for the U.S. government. And I worked for the CIA for 6 years, and that there was nothing but conflict there too, because I was up against bureaucrats. Bureaucrats ran the whole thing. They ran the security, they ran the offices, they ran the intelligence, which was, we're talking about what was going on in various parts of the world, were all subject to the approval and the acceptance of the bureaucrats. And that's what made working there so impossible. And eventually, after 6 years, I finally left. By the way, the one thing that they could never ever understand is they couldn't accept that I was not a danger to their institution. As a result, I had 6 lie detector tests. And finally, the way I finally convinced them that there was nothing for them to find was when they kicked me up to the highest level of the lie detector bureaucracy. I actually was interviewed by the chief of the lie detector department, whatever the heck they called it exactly, I don't remember. But he was in charge of all the lie detector testers and all the people that were administering the lie detectors. And I finally told him, I said, listen, you've already given me 6 of these. This is the 6th one. You can give me 6 more. You can give me 1 every year. You can give me 2 every year, 3, whatever you want. I can't tell you anything different. I'm not going to harm any interest of the United States. I'm not only I'm a proud American. I'm an American by choice. I was 11 years old when I got here. I didn't get my citizenship until I was 16, and I made the choice because the way it worked was at the time that if you were past a certain age, and when my parents received their citizenship, I was already 16 years old. And sorry, I got mine when I was 17 or 18. But the point was that because when my parents received theirs, I was too old to automatically become a citizen. I think it was something I cut off for something like 14 or 15. By the time, if you were 15 years old, you had to make your own decision. You have to wait until you got old enough to become a citizen on your own. And that's why I had to do it on my own. So I made it was a very clear, very unequivocal decision. I had to study for the citizenship exams. I had to take them. I had to prove to the official in the immigration department that I was indeed a person that wanted to be an American, that I wholeheartedly believed in this country and was going to do the best I can to advance its success and its possibilities. So, but the point was that this guy, when I told him this, I'm not sure what he said. All I know is I finally got the clearance, and then they didn't bother me anymore. But then what the problem came was then I was suddenly in conflict with my bosses at the particular department where I worked, and by this time there were all kinds of other things that happened. I don't want to go into all the details, but they saw that I didn't like the place. I want to get out of there, and they made sure that they helped me. And so with the mutual sort of assistance, I finally ended up leaving the CIA. That's another long story. It's worth a separate video. Anyway, I don't want to make this too long. So the point is that finally I left there too, and that was where I saw this mass psychosis most directly, because I saw those bureaucrats. I saw the bureaucrats that were not interested in anything whatsoever that had anything to do with intelligence, quote unquote. It had nothing to do. All they were interested in was being promoted, getting their yearly promotions, and being kicked up to higher and higher levels and getting more and more money. That's all that was interesting to them. I don't think I met more than 1 or 2 people in that whole bureaucracy that was there because they were dedicated to really helping to find out information and provide information to the U.S. government and to U.S. agencies to help them understand the rest of the world. As I say, if there were 1 or 2 or 3 people, then I'm being very generous. Very sad and terrible, because I certainly believed that there was an important function that the CIA had, in particular the department where I worked. I worked in a Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which was providing information about all kinds of countries all over the world, and then later on in the teaching and education department, where I was in supervising language teachers in various languages. Anyway, I left, and that was sort of the first one of the large, large bureaucracies that luckily I escaped from. And then I ended up finding many, many more, unfortunately. The next 20 years were not free of bureaucrats and technocrats and the great materialists who believe in nothing whatsoever except their day-to-day advancement and their day-to-day materialist acquisitions, and don't want to believe anything else, and as a result are easily subjected to all kinds of manipulation, to the point where now we are at a point in the United States where we're all subject to manipulation. If we don't stand up and we don't say, no, we're not going to do this, we're done for. This is our last chance. We have to start making sure that we go out and vote, and make sure that the vote is accurate and true, and they're not stealing them. They're not committing fraud. Because if they are, and if they do, and if they manage to steal another election, we're finished. We will never be able to get it back again. Then they will completely dominate us, and we can basically say goodbye to all those principles that our founding fathers in the 18th century fought so hard for and worked so hard to establish and to formulate. So on that note, I appreciate you listening, and I hope you will at least tell me that you liked it, or make a comment. I'd love to have comments. I'll be happy to answer them, and maybe I'll see you at the next opportunity. Okay? Goodbye.